In 2019, a ranger patrolling a remote trail in the mountains heard a radio transmission that made him stop cold. The voice coming through the static belonged to another ranger, one who had disappeared 3 days earlier. Across America's national parks, rangers encounter situations that never appear in public reports, disturbing incidents buried in quiet logs and unfinished investigations. Some of those stories were never meant to be heard. Glacier National Park, Montana, 2018. Late summer in Glacier is usually quiet after dark. Most visitors return to their campsites before sunset, leaving the deeper trails empty except for wildlife and the occasional ranger patrol. That night, Ranger Daniel Mercer was assigned to check a remote backcountry campsite nearly 8 miles from the nearest road. The trail leading there passed through dense pine forest where the trees grew so tightly together that even moonlight barely touched the ground. Mercer expected a routine patrol. The campsite had been reserved by 2 backpackers earlier that day, but they hadn't checked out at the ranger station as required. When Mercer reached the clearing, he immediately noticed something wrong. The campsite was empty. But their gear was still there. 2 backpacks leaned against a fallen log. A small camp stove sat beside a pot that had burned dry long ago. A sleeping bag lay half unrolled near the fire pit. It looked as if the hikers had simply stepped away for a moment. Mercer radioed the station and began searching the surrounding woods, calling their names into the darkness. No response. Then he noticed the footprints. They led away from the campsite toward the forest. At first there were 2 sets. Then, about 20 yards in, only one set continued. Mercer assumed one of the hikers had gone off alone. But after another 30 yards, the remaining footprints simply stopped. The ground beyond was undisturbed. No tracks. No drag marks. Nothing. It was as if the person had vanished mid-step. Search teams spent 3 days combing that section of forest. Neither hiker was ever found. And the trail leading to that campsite was quietly closed the following season. Yosemite National Park, California, 2021. Rangers working night patrols in Yosemite are used to strange sounds echoing through the valleys. Wind moving through granite cliffs can create eerie whistles, and distant wildlife often carries farther than expected. But one ranger reported hearing something that never appeared in any wildlife guide. Just after midnight, Ranger Lisa Tran was driving along a service road near Tuolumne Meadows. The road wound through open forest with long stretches of darkness between occasional moonlit clearings. Her patrol radio crackled with routine chatter from another ranger checking campgrounds. Then the signal suddenly cut out. Static filled the speaker. A few seconds later, a voice came through. It sounded faint, almost distant. "Can anyone hear me?" Tran grabbed the radio. The voice continued. "I'm on the ridge. I can't find the trail." The strange part wasn't what the voice said. It was who it sounded like. The voice was nearly identical to Ranger Kevin Holt. But Holt wasn't on patrol. He had gone missing during a backcountry search operation 2 nights earlier. Tran radioed dispatch immediately. Dispatch confirmed Holt's radio had never transmitted since the day he disappeared. Yet the voice continued speaking. "Something's moving out here. I think it's following me." The transmission lasted about 15 seconds before fading back into static. Search teams rushed to the ridge area mentioned in the message. They found nothing. No radio. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there recently. And Holt was never located. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, 2017. The Smokies are known for their thick fog and vast wilderness areas. With more than 800 miles of trails, it's one of the easiest places in the country for someone to disappear. That year, 2 rangers were investigating a report from campers who claimed they had heard someone screaming deep in the forest late at night. The screams sounded distant and irregular, echoing through the valleys. At first the rangers assumed it might be an injured hiker. They followed the direction the campers described, hiking several miles along a narrow trail that eventually faded into overgrown brush. As night fell, the forest became almost completely silent. Then the screaming started again. It echoed somewhere ahead of them. But it didn't sound like someone calling for help. It sounded wrong. The tone never changed. No words. Just the same drawn-out cry repeating every few minutes. The rangers followed it for nearly half an hour. Eventually they reached a small clearing where the sound seemed to stop. That's when they noticed the campsite. A single tent sat near a dead fire pit. Inside the tent were supplies, clothes, and a flashlight. But no person. The screaming started again. This time it came from deeper in the woods behind them. The rangers searched until sunrise. No injured hikers were found. The campsite belonged to a man who had registered at a trailhead 3 days earlier. He never returned. And no one ever determined where those screams came from. Rocky Mountain National Park, Colorado, 2020. Ranger patrol logs sometimes record strange wildlife behavior. But one report described something far more unsettling. 2 rangers were checking a remote alpine trail after receiving reports of abandoned gear along the route. About 4 miles in, they found the first item. A hiking boot lying in the middle of the path. Farther down the trail they found a backpack. Its contents were scattered across the ground as if someone had dropped it while running. Then they found the footprints. The prints moved erratically through the dirt and gravel, as though the person had been moving quickly. But something about them stood out. They weren't alone. A second set of tracks followed beside them. These prints were much larger and deeper. And they didn't look like standard hiking boots. The rangers followed the tracks nearly half a mile. Eventually the trail opened into a rocky clearing. That's where both sets of footprints ended. Not faded. Not turning back. Just stopped. Search teams later found the hiker's vehicle still parked at the trailhead. No other hikers had entered the area that day. The missing man was never located. And the ranger report describing the second set of tracks was removed from the public incident log. Olympic National Park, Washington, 2015. The rainforests of Olympic National Park are some of the darkest forests in the United States. Towering trees and dense moss absorb sound and light, making even daytime patrols feel isolated. One evening, a ranger stationed near the Hoh River received multiple radio calls from campers reporting strange lights moving through the forest. They described small beams of light weaving between the trees far from any established trails. At first the ranger assumed they were unauthorized hikers using flashlights. He hiked toward the area to warn them about being off trail after dark. But the deeper he walked into the forest, the stranger things became. The lights moved silently between the trees ahead of him. Every time he approached, they seemed to drift farther away. Eventually he reached a narrow clearing. The lights were now directly in front of him. 3 of them, hovering just above the ground. Then all 3 lights abruptly switched off at the same time. The forest went completely dark. The ranger rushed forward expecting to find people standing there. But the clearing was empty. The ground was covered in thick moss that held footprints clearly. There were none. The ranger returned to the station and filed a report. No explanation was ever recorded. Yellowstone National Park, Wyoming, 2019. Yellowstone rangers frequently investigate reports of strange radio interference due to the park's geothermal activity. But one incident didn't behave like normal signal distortion. During a routine patrol near a remote thermal basin, Ranger Caleb Ward began receiving short bursts of radio chatter. The signal sounded weak and distorted. At first it resembled normal static. Then words began forming through the noise. "Hello, hello." Ward answered immediately. But the transmission didn't respond. Instead, it repeated the same phrase again. "Hello, hello." The voice sounded mechanical and strangely slow. Ward checked the frequency. The signal was coming through on an emergency ranger channel that only park staff could access. Then something changed. The voice said his name. Caleb. Ward froze. No one else was scheduled to patrol that section of the park. The radio continued speaking. "Caleb, don't go farther." The signal abruptly cut out. Ward later discovered something disturbing. The voice on the transmission matched an older ranger who had worked in Yellowstone years earlier. That ranger had died during a search mission in the same area more than a decade before. No one ever identified where the signal originated. Mount Rainier National Park, Washington, 2022. During winter patrols, rangers often monitor remote trails for stranded climbers. One January night, a ranger monitoring radio traffic received a distress call from somewhere on the mountain. The signal was weak but clear. A man's voice reported being lost near a snow-covered ridge. He gave rough coordinates before the signal began fading. Rescue teams immediately began preparing for a search. But when the ranger checked the climbing permits for that day, something didn't make sense. No climbers had registered for that area. Still, the distress call sounded genuine. The rescue team followed the coordinates through heavy snowfall. After hours of searching, they finally reached the ridge. What they found there made the situation even stranger. A small campsite sat partially buried in snow. The equipment looked old. The tent fabric was faded and brittle. Inside the tent they found a rusted cooking stove and outdated climbing gear. Everything appeared to have been sitting there for years. The team later checked historical records. A climber had vanished on that same ridge nearly 12 years earlier. His campsite was never found. And the distress call recorded that night matched his voice almost perfectly. But no one could explain how a radio signal could have been transmitted from equipment that had clearly been abandoned for over a decade. The signal was never heard again. And sometimes, the most unsettling part of these ranger reports is that no one ever figured out what really happened.